Welcome to the Digital Marketing Victories Podcast, a podcast about the realities of digital marketing. Listen in each month to learn about the tactics and strategies, soft skills, and technical requirements that go into digital marketing success. I'm Catherine Wattier-Ong, owner of WO Strategies LLC, an organic traffic consultancy.
And I'm Jim Keeney, owner of Fiddle Web Consulting and founder of DAP, the platform for the engagement economy. Welcome. Let's get into it and celebrate our victories.
You are going to love this interview with Tom Critchlow. If you're an SEO, you know him from his work at Distilled and Google, but his most recent initiative, launching an SEO MBA program, is what I thought was just so perfect for this podcast. And he did not disappoint. His interview is so full of interesting tidbits that you're going to want pen and paper to take notes, possibly even listen to the episode more than once. So he answers questions like, how do we make the clients change? How can you be an effective consultant? How do we persuade the client to do something they've been unable to do so independently? And Tom unpacks how the change happens within an organization and how, as a consultant, you can kickstart that change. In fact, he even pinpoints the catalyst for this change and how to build a strong relationship with that person to keep the momentum going on your SEO or digital marketing projects. He talks about how consultants can bridge the gap that often happens between the people in the weeds and the executive team, and how to help those two groups communicate more effectively. He walks through how he structures his engagements for iterative work versus deliverables, and how that helps him keep the momentum going. We also talk a little bit about his upcoming book, which is currently tentatively called The Strategic Independent, which is free to read on his website at tomcritchlow.com. So without further ado, here's our interview with Tom Critchlow. So today we have Tom Critchlow on our podcast. Tom, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me. My name's Tom. I was born in the UK and I've been living in New York for about a decade. My background is mostly in SEO. I worked at an agency called Distilled that was started by my brother, that was just recently sold, actually. Worked there for a while and opened their New York office, which is what took me to the US. And then had a 2-year stint at Google doing all kinds of weird and wonderful things, nothing related to SEO. And then for the last 6 years, I've been out on my own as an independent consultant. So I work myself. I do a variety of consulting work for quite a wide range of clients that spans everything from SEO, content strategy, digital marketing, and a bunch of other things that people will pay me for. And yeah, you currently find me on the West Coast. We've been on a road trip across the country during the pandemic with 2 small kids. So that's me.
So where in England? What's your accent?
My accent is a little hard to place. I grew up in a place called Harrogate, which is actually in the north of England, but both my parents are from the south, and I don't really have a northern British accent. And now,
I was wondering.
Now my accent is some kind of chameleon mix, American and British, which I think my wife is forever regretful of, that I didn't keep the British accent.
So it's true. The English accent is the best way to meet American women. Is that?
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see if I need to keep it to stay in my relationship.
All right. So can you tell us a bit more about yourself and your marketing background, and how did you find digital marketing?
Yeah, I think I lucked into SEO just like everyone else did. My brother started Distilled back when I was kind of just coming out of college, and I was considering a career as a professional poker player, when he managed to convince me that I should take a look at this SEO business and the digital marketing stuff that was going on. And I went to go work for him part-time initially. I was like, I'm going to just, sure, I'll go work for my brother for a little bit, a couple of days a week while I get this professional poker career off the ground. And then it turns out that I think I actually enjoyed the SEO stuff more than poker, which is like a strange thing to say, but the hours are bad trying to play professional poker. That's a whole other story. But anyway, so I got into SEO kind of by accident, like everyone did. And I think what I really enjoyed about it was the ability to work across such a wide variety of disciplines, from the technical aspects to the content pieces to branding, marketing, and then of course just business generally, right? I'm just helping businesses grow. And so that's kind of been a focus for me over the years. And, I was very lucky to fall in with my brother and Distilled. I learned a ton there, both about SEO, but also about just how to do good consulting, how to convince clients to change. And that's kind of been a real focus for me throughout my whole career now, has been, how do you actually be effective, right? Not just delivering the reports or the documents that clients are asking for, but actually saying, how do we actually make clients change in a way that is useful and productive to them? And that is a whole kind of a deeper issue that requires thinking about, processes, team dynamics, culture, all kinds of things that really gets to the heart of how do we persuade this client to do something that they've so far been unable to do on their own.
Yes, that is exactly what we're hoping to talk to you about today on the podcast. So, on the Distilled or on your website, when you were talking about your experience with your brother at Distilled, you talked about you've got like three different things. One, that you said that business consulting is about taking ownership and getting close to the people and the problem, and that momentum is the key to success as you're trying to impact change. And you also talk about managing and hiring people and how it's about unlocking potential, not judging performance. I don't disagree on all three, but I'm kind of curious about how do you particularly get closer to your clients and work on driving momentum? And then related to the hiring part, how do you determine a new hire's potential versus looking at previous performance?
Yeah, good questions. So I think one of the advantages to being an independent consultant is that I often end up much more embedded with my clients' organizations than a typical agency might. It's not uncommon for me to actually have like an email address at that company, be in their Slack groups, and, be functioning as kind of a pseudo employee. And I treat that work as very much part of the consulting engagement, not as something kind of like adjacent to or like a side, kind of benefit or whatever. But I'm really saying, okay, if I'm really going to be effective here, I need to understand who the decision makers are. I need to understand how decisions get made. I need to understand the tempo that this organization works on. And so I treat all of those things as kind of deliberate work, right? When I start working with a client, I have to go find those things out. And sometimes a client will acknowledge that is useful and important work, but more often than not, it's the kind of thing that you kind of have to do behind the scenes, in a kind of implicit manner rather than explicit manner to be able to say, okay, now I have a good understanding of how we're going to pitch this change, what kind of change the company is even receptive to in the first place, and who we need to get buy-in from along the way. So that's been a big focus for me, and I'd say that 90% of the time, especially when you're dealing with things like content strategy, things like SEO, quote unquote, the answer is often relatively straightforward, right? I mean, like a great example is you go to a client and you take one look at their website, you're like, great, you got to make the content quality better, right? Your content quality is just not very good. But if you make the recommendation, make your content better, it's just going to fall on deaf ears, right? There's a whole system and a set of processes and a culture, incentive structure, tracking, measuring, all of those things that produce the quality of content that they're producing today. You can't just go in and say, do it better, right? I mean, you have to really understand both why the system is set up the way it is, who set it up that way, why it is incentivized to stay that way before you can even start to change it. And then when you think about, again, I think a lot of, or I should say, I think a classical mistake that a lot of younger people make, and I've made this mistake myself too, is trying to do everything all at once. Is trying to say, okay, well, we're in world A, we need to get to world B. I want to convince this client to do something differently. And we imagine that happens in a kind of big step change fashion. But actually changing systems typically happens in a much more kind of iterative, small steps kind of way, right? And this is both a good thing and a bad thing. It's a bad thing because it's frustrating and it takes longer to change than you think it does. But it's a good thing in that if you try and kind of tear something down and rebuild it, you're going to break a lot of things along the way. And so when we think about, and that gets back to the quote I have there about momentum, which is the thing that I always look for with a client is what is the smallest possible project that we can do that will demonstrate a meaningful step in the right direction that can get buy-in, can get sign off, and start us on that path. Because starting on that path is, assuming all goes well and assuming we do it correctly and assuming that we're right about the direction we want to go in, starting on that path is the kind of necessary first step to reaching our end goal. So that's kind of really big focus for me is, okay, yes, we need the big idea, we need the big pitch, we need the big strategy, we need the answer. But then what we really need is just to get going, to get started. And it's that getting started, which is a big barrier for a lot of companies. Again, what I often remind people of is this is necessarily true. When I was working at Google, I often got frustrated. I couldn't get my ideas implemented. I was like, I have all these great ideas. Why won't anybody listen to me? Why won't this company do these things that I'm advocating for? And somebody, a close friend of mine, reminded me that it's kind of by design. Like if all 30,000 employees at Google were able to get their ideas done, it would just be a complete
Chaos.
mess, right? Yeah, it would be awful. And so organizations, companies of all size are deliberately set up to stop your ideas from being implemented, right? And that is by design, designed to impose order on what would otherwise be just like, wild chaos. And so when you come in as a consultant or you come in or you're trying to, change a company that you work at, you kind of have to embrace this idea that the company is going to be resistant to change, and that's a good thing. And taking that as a given, how do you find a way to get started? How do you find a way to start on a path to a new world that isn't going to break everything along the way?
So how do you mediate between like the C-suite and the people who are actually attempting to get things done? Because in my experience, the C-suite has kind of a frustration or hope or an aspiration or something like that, but they don't really know what they want. Mm-hmm. And then what you do is you get into the mix with the people who are actually doing the work, and you find, they basically have a grasp of what they're doing right now. And maybe one or two have kind of really tried to push the limits. And so there might be good ideas that you can mine. But connecting those two dots is really difficult as a consultant. So I'm wondering if you've got any experiences or stories that you can tell about how you're able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I spend a lot of my time is trying to make that bridge from, the people who are on the front lines or in the details who have an understanding of what needs to get done, and then convincing the C-suite or the executive team that it should be done and it's a good idea. There's a great quote that I'm going to talk about in my newsletter, which is that ideas without details and details without ideas are both risky. And I think this is a really good example of bridging that gap between the people who are in the weeds and the executive team. And I think oftentimes what happens is that teams who are in the weeds kind of suffer from two things. They suffer from relying on some kind of complicated data to try and tell their story. And so and in the SEO world, this is like a great example of looking at like backlink data or looking at some like keyword data or something that they're incredibly familiar with and fluent with and believe tells their story. And yet when you go all the way up to the executive team, a CEO of an organization is typically not looking at like share of voice of keyword rankings or something like that, or like, backlink data. And so when presented with an argument that uses those metrics and those terms, they just don't really believe you. They're just a little bit like, I don't really know what these data points are, and I'm not really willing to stake a big budget on a project that is moving metrics that I'm not even like thinking about day to day. So that's one problem. And the second thing is just not telling a convincing enough story, not telling a compelling enough story. I think that it sounds kind of cheesy to say it, but like you really need an idea when you're pitching to an executive team to say, okay, I can show you the revenue numbers, I can show you the metrics that are going to be improved by this project, but the idea behind it, the story behind it needs to be simple to communicate and easily understood. And that's where it's something like, we need to make our site, more accessible to more users, or we need to, start writing longer content. Right. And like there has to be some kind of idea that then you frame the whole project around. And I think a lot of people that are in the day-to-day work kind of forget there needs to be like a single coherent idea, and instead try and get kind of a whole bunch of changes packaged up in one. And the SEO industry is, again, very guilty of this, and oftentimes of trying to say, okay, we have like 17 different things that we want to fix on the site. But there's no coherent story to it, right? It's just right. What are these 17 things? Why are they related? Why do we need to fix all of them, right? And I think that kind of like list of changes is just not a compelling way to get stuff done at the executive layer, right? You need to be packaging it up in some kind of story.
So I know in your engagements, you get a chance to, oftentimes you're brought in by somebody close to the C-suite, if not maybe the C-suite. But what tips, I'm sure in your experience though, you've been brought in with like a marketing manager level. So what are your tips for getting that introduction higher and getting in front of the C-suite?
Yeah, that's a classic kind of chicken and egg problem, and one that is difficult to solve for. But if you get brought into an organization too low down the kind of food chain, it is very difficult to work your way upwards. And so what is much easier, even though it is kind of slower, is to get brought in higher up the organization to begin with. And most of that comes down to just marketing and positioning, right? It's about how do you position yourself and how do you market yourself? How do you create a network around you of more senior folks? When I worked at Distilled, for example, we did a lot to very actively and directly encourage more senior level introductions, more senior level clients to reach out to us. It makes a big difference to get an introduction to a CMO than it does to like a VP of marketing or a director. And so I think when I think about marketing my own consulting work and my own consulting services, I talk a lot about, operating at the kind of business layer rather than the, tactical work, lower down the food chart, the food chain. And that can be difficult and kind of slow moving to really like get your head around. But I think that it can also follow the arc of your career. When I was younger and when I was working at Distilled, I used to talk all the time about like Here's how to, here's how to do like schema optimization. Here's how to use Excel to pull in data in all kinds of funky ways. And I was talking to people kind of like me, right? Who are, practitioners who are in the weeds, who are earlier in their career. But as I've gotten more senior and older, I've started to talk to a slightly different audience. And I think that's kind of a useful thing to bear in mind, which is that you don't have to get there overnight, right? Like, it isn't like I'm not going to convince like every independent consultant shouldn't be trying to talk to the CEO or the C-suite. If you're not doing that kind of work, or if you're not ready to talk at that level, then don't, right? Don't try and pretend to be something that you're not, but do recognize that the more senior point of contact that you can get, the better your engagements are going to be.
I agree. I spend more of my time in that group too, and pivoted myself on purpose to be doing more strategy work.
Well, then the nature of the pitch changes dramatically too, as you connecting the dots to the idea. Because, there are two things that are intersecting there. One is what you've talked about before, which is kind of building the network and building the interaction with people that will be helpful to you, like pivoting SEO into a exercise of trying to create those connections that become, magnifiers. And then everything else that you're talking sounds an awful lot like lean startup, which is find the idea, really crystallize it, test your hypotheses, find the idea, and then find the most, quickest, easiest, least expensive, least difficult way to prove out that idea. And that creates your momentum. And now you get into your discussion about momentum.
Yep. Yeah, totally.
So I don't want to lose track of the hiring bit, because I used to hire a lot on teams. I know folks listening do too. So you're focused on the potential. Did you have any processes or tips or tactics to sort of dig out somebody's potential versus past performance?
I mean, I think hiring is always a bit more of an art than a science in that respect. I think that I've always structured interviews and hiring questions around how people think rather than what they've done. I think it's important to try and understand the difference between somebody who has been given the opportunities to succeed or has been a part of things that have succeeded versus those that haven't, which has almost nothing to do with, okay, how do you think about a problem, right? And are you going to think about the problem in the way that we need you to think about the problem? Because most of these skills, again, things like SEO, I'm sure I'll get kind of a little bit of flack for this, but like things like SEO are not that hard to learn, right? And there are a lot of pieces of the job that can be very easily taught. What is much harder to teach is a way of thinking or a way of approaching problems, right? And so I think it's really important to try and make sure that we're clear-eyed about the culture and the environment of the organization that you're hiring for, and the kind of the fit to, okay, what kind of people do we want here that will be useful, will be able to operate in this environment, and so on. And so screening for potential, I like to ask very simple questions that tend to expose kind of, mindset more than capabilities. And so one of my favorite examples, my favorite question for interviewing SEOs is, you say, well, okay, what kind of websites do you look at that I might not have heard of? That doesn't have to be SEO websites, but any kind of websites. And people typically rattle off everything from, I look at this, sports blog to, I look at this knitting website, or, I'm active in this, stocks investing forum or whatever it might be. And then just ask them to list some ways to improve the website. And what I really love about the question is, you're poking at somebody's kind of passion space, right? They've just told you that this is somewhere that they like to hang out, they like to spend time, they like to care about it, and then asking them to improve it, and noting what kind of level of improvements people look at, right? And I think there are really kind of no right or wrong ways to answer the question, but certainly if somebody's very focused on the wrong kinds of things that would actually improve the website, that's kind of a clear red flag, versus somebody who's like, well, I actually have a really good plan for how this website could be improved. And I think that comes back to my consulting skills kind of point about, when you're trying to change an organization, it's good to have the right mindset around what kind of change is possible, and also what kind of change is actually useful. So a great example is people hanging out on ugly websites, and where the first thing I advocate for is like a brand, a design refresh or a design makeover. And you're like, well, is that actually the most important thing for that website? Like, seems like they're doing just fine with this ugly website. There must be other things that can be improved. And so it's, people looking at the obvious thing versus the thing that will actually kind of, move the needle or change their business.
Everybody still uses Craigslist. I mean,
Yeah, it's funny because one of the most substantial changes to Reddit recently is about 3 years ago, they switched to using Solar, which is an indexing solution as the back end, which allowed them to then handle their content in a much more sophisticated way and connect things across the different boards in a much more sophisticated way. And you really see that demonstrating. And when you look at Reddit, there's an ugly website, but their community doesn't care. They don't care.
Right.
Making it look better is not really the most important thing.
Right. And I'm the first one to advocate for better design and better presentation on the web. I think it is important, but I think you have to connect it back to some kind of like actual problem, right?
An outcome. Yeah.
Rather than just, I would like it if this website was prettier.
So I follow you on Twitter, no surprise. And I was actually noticed that you have independent consulting practice and you're about to write a book about this or about how to run one. So can you tell us a little bit more? Because I think I'm certainly interested, as are probably a lot of our listeners.
Yeah. And so I'm kind of at the final stages of writing that book. The working title is The Strategic Independent. And it's all basically free to read on my website. I've got about 50,000 words written there. And I'm in the final stages of kind of hiring an editor and turning it into a physical book. So it'll be out soon-ish, hopefully. And the book is, I kind of joke that I didn't really write it for my readers. I wrote it for myself, which is not necessarily the best way to write a book, but it's how I did it. And it kind of, it grew by accident out of the writing that was on my site. I'd say the biggest idea for me around the book is there's a ton of writing about being independent, about being freelance, about being an independent consultant, which tries to push you down a particular path, tries to say, here's how to do it. Here's how you should do it. Here are the right ways to do it. Here are the wrong ways to do it. What I wanted to write a book about and what I felt there was an opportunity for is a book that kind of embraced the differences and embraced the uniqueness of every single independent consultant and every single freelancer, because there are so many different ways to do it. And the people that I've met across the spectrum of people who are mixing and matching different kinds of revenue streams and who are doing different kinds of work with different kinds of clients is just, there's just a million different ways to do it and a million different ways to approach it and think about it. And a lot of the differences stem from individual differences, right? So it stems from, okay, I really love being face-to-face with clients, for example. I love to be in the room. I love to run workshops. Some people are terrified of being face-to-face with a client, right? Some people are just not wired that way. They don't want to do that kind of work. It's like, okay, well, great. If you don't want to do that work, then don't sell that kind of work. Don't be that kind of consultant. There are other ways to do it, right? And I think that's kind of what I wanted the book to focus on, was not like, you too can follow my simple system and $100,000. But also like, hey, you should carve your own path, and that's totally possible. There is a depth here and a kind of a variety of approaches. And then paired with that, I wanted to explore some of the psychological kind of games that happen when you're independent, mostly that you play with yourself. Things like, what do you call yourself? Are you a freelancer or are you a consultant? Why does that matter? Who cares? And kind of, think about the labels and the positioning and the, emotional stability or not of being a consultant. So that's kind of what the book's about. Like I said, most of it is free to read on my website, and it should be out soon.
So are you going to cover some of the stuff in Company of One? Because I always find it interesting being a solo myself. How many people are like, oh, are you going to hire an employee? I'm like, no, definitely no. And how that's sort of like a bad thing. Like this whole idea that you have to scale to be successful.
I'm a little bit agnostic to that. Company of One's a great book. I think I am very specifically positioning the book for folks who think they might be an independent consultant and all the things that come with that. So it's very focused on client work in particular. It's very focused on being somebody who sells essentially time for money in some kind of variety of guises. And I'm not really talking about in this book the kind of the creator economy of like, the building online courses or selling and writing books, even though that's also what I'm doing. It's very much focused around, okay, you want to do a service for clients and you want to sell consulting work or client work in some form. How do you do that? And how does that make you feel?
There's a concept in your book that I'm fascinated by, Chronos versus Kairos. Mm-hmm. Am I pronouncing the second word right? Can you dive into that and talk about it a little bit? I'm very interested in this.
Yeah. I think the essence of that piece is about not getting trapped in an arbitrary expectation of work. And I think that the word that really highlights this is a deliverable, especially if you've come from the agency world. It's very common to be in this mindset of, okay, the client is asking for, let's use an SEO analogy. The client is asking for an SEO audit. That becomes a deliverable that I can price and I can scope and I can spend, X amount of time producing this deliverable and then handing it back to the client. The problem comes in a couple of ways. One is that deliverable is almost certainly not as useful as anyone thought it was going to be. The output the clients want is change. They don't want a document. 99% of the time. Sometimes, yes, a document is the thing. But what clients really want is their website to be better, or their SEO to be improved, or their revenue to go up. And a deliverable is really a kind of an abstracted kind of proxy for that. And the reason that deliverables exist is because agencies in particular, clients too, to a certain extent, they need to standardize work. Right? They need a way of being able to talk about a work that is able, so they can write an RFP for an agency, or so they can talk about the work, price it correctly, standardize it, build processes around it, and so on. But as an independent, you kind of have the luxury of stepping outside of that and really examining from first principles. Okay, what do you really need here? Okay, you need the website to be better, or you need revenue to go up. Okay, let's be laser focused on the things that are going to make that happen. And so the way that I approach client work is in a much more kind of iterative fashion to say, okay, you want an SEO audit. Let me create a kind of outline of where I think the biggest opportunities are and send that in a kind of work in progress manner to the client. And you do that in a much more rapid time frame. So instead of spending 4 weeks on an SEO audit, I'll spend a few days or a week on here are where I see some opportunities, here are where I see some issues. Let's have a conversation about it and let's see what happens from that. And then based off the conversation with the client, it's usually obvious that one or two of those issues have much more momentum or much more feasible than the others. And that actually we can pull the CTO into the conversation and start to get those in the product roadmap. And kind of this iterative, collaborative working environment is structured around what I call kind of Kairos time, which is just in time living, versus Chronos time, which is clock time, right? These kind of concepts come from the Greek gods of time that I'm not really going to get into right here. But the point is that I think that you can be much more effective for a client by kind of sidestepping these formalized deliverables and really focusing on value and momentum and creating change, like we talked about earlier. But at the same time, if you peg yourself to these kind of these bigger chunks of work and these kind of deliverable thinking as an independent, you also just get massively overwhelmed because you're the only one doing the work. And so if you sign yourself up for 3 deliverables at the same time, you just have this kind of this big kind of schedulized, heavy workload, which is very difficult to kind of fit together. It's very difficult to do 2 of those things at once, or to do them back to back and make sure that they fit neatly together. Whereas, I'm doing this client's work now, and then next month I'm doing this client's work. And that isn't how client work happens as an independent. It's much more I've got a phone call on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday morning, I've got a quick session with this client. And then Thursday afternoon, I got to go, jump on this thing. And so you need a way of working that kind of reflects that more nimble and more kind of iterative lifestyle. And so for both those reasons, that's kind of what this post Chronos and Kairos is all about, which is how do you manage your own time as an independent to not feel so stressed and overwhelmed all the time, whilst also at the same time taking an approach to work which is actually more effective for clients and faster. So that's what the whole thing is about.
And do you walk into pricing models with that too?
Yeah, so this comes back to a little bit of my frustration with all of the writing about independent consulting. Everything you read will tell you that trading hours for money is a mistake. Everyone will try and tell you that value pricing is the way to do it. I've spent 6 years building a consulting business where I bill on a day rate, and that's it. I don't do value-based pricing. I've tried and I suck at it or it doesn't work. But all of my work is built on a day rate or, some kind of approximation thereof. And what I like about that is that actually, by pegging my billable hours to time, it allows you to work on a wider range of less well-scoped work. And so a lot of my work that I do is very loosely scoped, right? It's very the scope of work that I sign with a client will be very open-ended around, okay, I'm going to spend 2 days a week working on improving your business or improving SEO or whatever, but without too much detail or scope around kind of specific deliverables and timeframes and so on. Now, obviously, sometimes, especially for bigger clients, they need some kind of rigor and some kind of detail around what you're actually going to work on. But what's nice about that way of setting up a client relationship is it frees you up to be useful. It frees you up to work on the things that matter, and not to work on the things that we arbitrarily agreed on before we even started working together. And I talk about this as well in a chapter of the book called Workshops as Portals, where I talk about doing a workshop up front with a client as a way to scope the work together. It can be radically effective because it allows you to actually define the things that are worth working on, rather than, again, working on a kind of arbitrary set of deliverables that the industry decides is kind of the thing that you should work on. And again, in the SEO world, to come back to this example, things like SEO audits and keyword research and things like that, these are deliverables that very often bear almost no relation to the value that you can provide for a client, right? They're too big and they're too slow and they're not relevant enough to the actual problems at hand for the client. And you'd be much better off just getting some things done.
Yep.
And so that's what I try and do in my work.
So do you find yourself having more kind of confrontational conversations with customers because of this, because you're now free to actually focus on the thing that really needs to be done as opposed to what bag of whatever they come in with? Because I find that so I do a fair amount of development for startups.
Mm-hmm.
And what I like to tell them is I tell them what not to build so that they get to market. And I find that the more that I move towards really freeing myself up to consult with them about what they really should be doing, as opposed to what, a typical development agency would do for them or development firm would do for them. I find myself in a lot more conversations where the nature of the conversation is, okay, let's unpack that weird assumption that you have that doesn't make any sense. And let's figure out how to reconnect it to something that actually has value to you so that I can get work done faster so I can actually deliver your product.
Yeah, I wouldn't describe a lot of the interactions I have as more confrontational, but I would describe them as maybe kind of like a level deeper. I think, there are a lot of conversations that happen around, like you said, trying to unpack assumptions or ways of looking at their business in a way that other people aren't necessarily asking the questions around. I think maybe because I also have a pretty well documented kind of public presence, and like I'm writing the book, and a lot of clients that come to me are kind of usually fairly well primed to understand the kind of work that I'm going to do. And so I don't think that it's a big surprise or a big confrontation around trying to operate in a way that they're not expecting. But I do think there is a healthy amount of kind of like challenging their assumptions that comes with the work that I do, for sure. And I think that's often where one of the most valuable things that you could do as a consultant, I think, is give a client a new way of looking at the world, whether that's looking at their customers or looking at their own business or whatever. It's just opening their eyes to say, you really weren't thinking about it in the right way, or it's not even about right or wrong. You weren't thinking about it this way, and now you can. And that can be a useful kind of tool for what you're doing, is to say, maybe you should consider this more often. And through that way of thinking, you can open up to that kind of cascading impact to change, right? That cascading impact. Well, if you look at the world this way, you might set up a different kind of incentive structure for teams. And once you have a different incentive structure for teams, they might operate differently, and teams operating differently is how you get change. And so when you think about changing organizations, one of those kind of like little tiny flywheels is changing the way that one of the senior executives looks at the world, to say, actually, people don't work that way, or people don't believe what you believe, or people don't think the way that you think. And that can be really powerful.
Also, because I used to be in-house and I've been both sides of the fence, as you're going back to the fact that it's hard to change inside an organization because it's just, they're not going to, frankly, not going to listen to you. They're just not set up to do that. But an outside consultant can say literally the same thing and be listened to, which is why I flipped from in-house to outside. But regardless, I think it's your role as an outside consultant to actually say some of that stuff sometimes. That's just how the world is set up.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think this can be a significant point of tension or frustration. I think for folks who are in-house, who see consultants kind of coming in, being able to recommend changes or talk about changes or get buy-in for things that they've been advocating for years. And I always try and have a very healthy kind of humbleness and respect for that. As a consultant, you're almost never coming in with quote unquote the answer. You're coming in to make sense of some kind of miscommunication that's happening internally, and you're standing on the shoulders of the people that came there before and trying to kind of help the system. What I like to think about is helping the client system kind of heal itself in a way, right? So it's, if you think about as a consultant, you might think, okay, the client is hiring me to solve a problem for them, and actually that's very rarely the case. A client is usually hiring you to help them solve their own problems in the future. And that starts by asking, well, why have they been unable to do that so far? Why has this organization not been able to convince themselves to do this change themselves, right? Like, what is it about their biases, their culture, the systems, processes, whatever, that will hold them back? And I think what's important to recognize also is that it's usually not the consultant that is actually the catalyst, right? It is the person hiring the consultant that is the catalyst. It's the person that hires the consultant that has the initial kind of aha moment, which is like, oh, we need a way to do X, Y, and Z. And the consultant is just a tool that allows that to happen, right? And so I try and make sure that my stance when I'm working with clients is not of the kind of the hero consultant, riding in on a horse, kind of saving the day or like having the ideas, and much more as a kind of facilitator or tool to say, use me in the way that is most useful, and between us we'll figure out a way to make the system work better.
It's been my experience that in most organizations of any degree of size and complexity, the future state, the answer to the future state is already in the organization somewhere.
Yes.
So if you can facilitate identifying it and promoting it, and then connect it to the reason why, then that may be the healthiest, best thing that could happen in the organization. And what then happens is, people begin to acknowledge, oh, we knew it all along.
Totally. And I mean, a classic example of that I come into often is one of the biggest frustrations that happens is that the executive team isn't seeing, quote unquote, a big enough idea from the kind of the team that's working on the details, while the team that's working in the weeds is frustrated that the executive team isn't giving them the buy-in or the budget to do what they want to do. And I don't want to trivialize the problem because it's a very real problem, but the solution is often relatively straightforward, which is just trying to make sure that we meet somewhere in the middle. Just want to say, okay, there is a bigger idea here. And the bigger idea is basically just getting everything done. But the team wants to get done, but in some kind of structure, in some kind of framework, and in some kind of incentive structure that the executive team buys into. The executive team says, yes, I believe that idea is worth doing and big enough and interesting, and I understand it, right? That's another big piece here is, instead of, again, comes back to this idea of like a list of changes, instead of just a list of things that we want to get done, there's an idea here. There's a reason why we're going to do all these things, and it's pitched in a language that the executive team can actually buy into. So yeah, you're absolutely right that the answer is almost always there, right? It's very rarely the consultant's job to come in with some answer that wasn't already inside the organization. And I see my role often as just a bridge to say, okay, I can help bridge the gap between the executive team and the team that's on the ground, and I can help kind of package and position this in a way that is going to help everyone move forward.
Well, and I think one of the things that you're demonstrating is your kind of interdisciplinary approach or cross-disciplinary approach essentially facilitates your ability to do that. And that gets back to your original point about independent consultant, is figure out who you are, right, figure out what you're bringing to the table, and then manifest that within your organizations. It dovetails to what you're saying about being a friend to the people that you're working with in the organization. It's the friends who have a unique characteristic that help us see ourselves in the right way.
Yep.
Yeah. And I know Dan Shore, who's host of Experts on the Wire, he was previous on this podcast, and he mentioned quite a bit about being friendly as one of the keys to sort of getting stuff done. But how specifically do you engineer and build those relationships? What are the things you do, especially now where we're stuck on Zoom? Are there things that you just do instinctively for every client relationship that helps you deepen that?
There's a chapter in my book called Optimism as an Operating System, which kind of gets to that same idea, which is, you have to be liked to get things done. But to answer your question more directly, I think that one of the biggest pieces of missing context that a lot of both agencies and consultants kind of overlook is, what is your point of contact's agenda? Right? The person that's hiring you, what are they trying to do? Right? And so for the CEO, it might be they need to look good for their board, or they need to present, they have a quarterly board meeting where they need to appear competent and so on and so forth. For a CMO, it might be, I need to demonstrate that the marketing is effective within the organization, or that we have a good marketing plan, whatever. For a VP of marketing, it might be, I want to try and take the CMO's job. I want to kind of level up to a new thing. And there's a variety of these things, but treating your point of contact as a human, right? To say, what do they actually want out of this engagement, above and beyond just kind of business results and the outcome of working together, which is kind of a given. What are the deeper forces at work? And I think that is a more useful frame than simply kind of being friendly. Is obviously important, and like I said, I wrote a chapter about something similar, which is definitely a key idea. But more importantly, is like, what is the agenda of this person, and how do you support their agenda? Because I think that's kind of a key, especially for long-term work. Like, a key piece that can kind of go missing is, if you're not furthering their agenda, if you're not helping them with their strategic goals, then you're kind of going to get commoditized and sidelined, right? Even if you keep working together, even if there's a good client relationship there, you're not really going to have the access that you need to work on the kind of really strategic project. So I think it's important to treat your clients as humans, to be able to say, what does this human want? And, I often have relatively frank conversations with my clients around, once we've been working together a while, there's typically a conversation of like, well, how long are you going to stay in this job? Right? Like, why, like, do you want to stay here? Like, what are you trying to get done? And when you can get to that level of conversation with your client, that opens up a really good and useful frame for thinking about the work that you're doing together to say, okay, well, I obviously have to be useful for this client. I have to do the work that's asking for and add value, but at the same time, I have to be mindful of their objectives and what they want to be doing. And sometimes that can be as simple as, they want to expand their context to be good at a wider variety of things. I can actually help them that. Like we can do projects together that like actually, stretch the client or operate in a new way. And that's where, that's where I think some of the most interesting work happens is, treating your clients as this kind of multifaceted client as organization, client as individual, client as human, thinking on the different layers can really open up some interesting work.
I was just going to ask you when you asked those questions, whether it was the discovery. So you just answered it for me.
As soon as you can, right? As soon as you have the relationship is trying to get to that good stuff. You can't do it too soon. That's it's also a kind of failure mode in being too brash, but yeah.
Since you opened the door, so what is your website?
TomCritchlow.com.
Do you have, say it again?
TomCritchlow.com, which is my name.
And spell your last name. Making it easier for people to find you. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So it's Tom Critchlow, CRITCHLOW, just TomCritchlow.com.
And then do you have kind of a plan for your book? How long before? Do you have a sense? I get the feeling that it's a work in progress and you don't really have kind of a date certain, but do you have kind of projections?
Like I said, I'm kind of moving into editing phase right now. I'm hoping that it'll be out kind of on sale by the summer.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I just thought, hey, what can I do for you to help you further your career? And it seems like, well, let's at least tell them how to get in touch with you. Are you on any of the major social media platforms in a big way or?
Yeah, Twitter is where I'm most active. Just again, my name at Tom Critchlow. I also, relevant for this conversation that we've had, I've got a new project that I'm launching called the SEO MBA, which you can find at SEOMBA.com. And my aspiration for that is to build that into a kind of an online course specifically for SEOs around all the things we just talked about, how to be effective at the executive layer, how to get buy-in, how to use consulting skills to get things done. And hopefully I will not talk at all about how to actually do SEO. That's my goal with that project. So that's interesting. It's an email newsletter and soon online course.
And are you going to offer coaching as part of that? Because that was a question from one of my networks.
You mean like one-on-one coaching?
Yeah. They were asking if you were going to do some sort of group coaching or some sort of one-on-one as part of it.
I have not thought about that, but maybe. I think I'd be open to it. I think, my plan for the course is to offer a mixture of kind of live cohort-based classes and kind of self-paced classes. And so the kind of cohort-based ones would certainly be like small group coaching or small group kind of teaching. I hadn't necessarily thought specifically about coaching, but yeah, certainly open to it.
Great. So we've already covered how people can learn about you. Do you want to share your winner resource with other people today? That's the other thing we usually do on closing.
There's something that I saw recently that I thought was really great. I'll send a link to you so you can put it in the show notes. But Smashing Magazine recently did a really big tear down about improving their site speed. And although that sounds kind of very nerdy and in the weeds, I'd encourage everyone to check it out because the way they approached it really broke down the problem from kind of first principles and from a user's perspective versus really talking about the metrics and talking about like, FCP and LCP and all these other metrics that nobody cares about, or rather people care about, but kind of abstracted away. And I thought it was just a really good case study in kind of building from first principles, a kind of user story around the change and demonstrating, why page speed was important, why a layout shift mattered and that kind of thing. So that was one of the things that I really enjoyed reading recently.
Awesome. And so just to remind our listeners, so the SEO MBA program, they can sign up on your website and it's an email newsletter at the moment?
Correct.
I've just been sitting here listening, absorbing. It's been fabulous.
Well, thank you so much for having me on.
So you pick up on strange attractors and chaos and complexity, that's my avocation. I started obsessing about that in 1989-90, and I've never let go of that. So,
oh wow, we should really talk about that. My current planned book cover is a stranger. Actually, this is a slight tangent, but my aspiration for the book, because I'm self-publishing, so I have a lot of control over it, is to actually put a unique strange attractor on the cover of every copy of the book.
Cool.
And so, yeah, we should talk about that.
Definitely. Yeah. Earlier, when you were talking about finding the small kernel that you pivot on, I was translating that into autopoiesis and self-catalyzing systems. And I was like, he's speaking my language.
we should have a podcast just about strange attractors. I would love that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. No, way back in '89, I was reading Tom Peters, who had a article in the Washington Business Journal. And he was talking about business and everything. And I started connecting that to Glick's book, Chaos. And then, the whole field of complexity exploded. And there used to be a kind of a conference on using nonlinear dynamics within the organization. I actually paid my way out to St. Paul, Minneapolis to go to that conference. And
That's great.
I just, it's one of those things where you just it governs your whole life all the way through, and you keep thinking, I'll write a book, and I never have done it. But
you should write the book. Let's do it. I think there's a ton of I think modern organization theory is really about treating organizations as complex systems that aren't deterministic, right? And I think that is just a really rich. It requires a little bit of getting up to speed with, the chaos theory. But once you have that, it's a very rich mental model for how organizations work. And in particular, how organizations fail, right? That there's a really great website. I'll send this over so you can link it in the show notes as well, about how complex systems fail. And every single one of those descriptions very clearly articulates a problem that you might have working with a client, like working with an organization, trying to convince them to change. And it really goes back to everything we just talked about, which is, changing a system. So forgive the digression. I know we're about over time, but I wrote about this in my book as well, about every client is a system that is producing a set of outputs that might be the wrong outputs, but the system is currently balanced. Like, it's in balance because it is currently working.
Yep.
And if you want to change the organization, you have to accept that you're going to change a system that is currently in balance. You have to take it out of balance in some way to be able to change it. And that's just like a really interesting way to look at trying to change an organization. Again, it goes back to this idea that you can't just start operating in a different manner without breaking a bunch of stuff. And I think that is just, too few people understand that really kind of inherently, that, changing clients is a difficult task because you're taking a system out of balance.
Well, and it puts people in stress. I think that some people don't notice that either, that because I spend a lot of time in-house changing organizations, and it's just really tough because you're stressing everybody's day to day, which for you is okay. You're the change agent, but for other people, it's really not. Do you ever not pick up clients because
Totally.
during the discovery, you're like, this is never going to work,
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, I think any agency or consultant that is interested in doing good work has to say no sometimes. I think that's absolutely. And to come back to your point about stress, I think that there's a very clear line between changing organizations and making sure that you're communicating clearly, right? I think this is a huge piece about change that people overlook, is you have to communicate. Like, you have to over communicate what the change is, how it's going, why it's happening, what it means, right? And again, a lot of this goes back to, you can't change an organization without changing their incentive structure. And so when you change an organization, people feel threatened because they feel their incentive structure is challenged, right? You're asking people to do something differently, but if you don't change their incentive structure, you're asking them to do something differently that might change their incentives, right? A very simple manner is, okay, I have been told by my boss that good work looks like X. If you're asking me to do Y, you have to explain to me how my boss is going to appreciate Y just as much as X. There's a very clear kind of connection there between communicating clearly and the stress of changing an organization. Yeah, absolutely. Changing an organization puts it in stress, right? That's a very simple mental model that is, very powerful.
Well, and the way I used to, you may not remember this, but back in the early 90s, it was all about change management. There were all these consultants, change management consultants. And I was instinctively kind of against that. And so what I used to do is I simply say, well, the human being experiences change as stress, and stress leads to depression. Therefore, if you're going to change the organization suddenly, then what you're essentially saying is you're going to reduce the productivity of everybody in the organization by at least 30%. And I don't think that's what you want to do. So then I used to do the old cone of, when is change not change? Change is not change when it's growth. And what's the difference between growth and change? I reach for growth. Change is foisted upon me. So as long as you think in those terms, because over communicating is essentially giving them something in front of them to reach out to. as opposed to something that is forced down upon them. And that hasn't changed. I used to say that back in the early 90s, and it's like, it hasn't changed a single thing. So, and it was funny because way back in the day, a lot of consultants, there were a lot of INTJ type consultants who would come in and say, okay, I'm going to completely change everything that you do. It was all part and parcel of the leverage buyouts and things like that. It's like, oh, we could break this up and do so much more. And you said it very much, which is you have to get inside there and kind of understand the way the organization is functioning to figure out how to take the kernels that already exist that will create the future state and bring them up through the ranks so that they become the primary strange attractor instead of something that's just barely surviving on the edges.
Yeah, totally. I think you said it best. Yeah, the idea of growing from something that we have rather than tearing down the system and trying to rebuild it is every client is always it's always a better functioning system than you give it credit for, right? That's one of the things I've learned also. Is it's very easy to look at an organization from the outside and be like, oh, this is terrible. You're not doing X, Y, and Z. You're not doing these things, blah, blah, blah. Like, all we've got to do is we've got to come in and do those things and it'll be great. But what you forget is that the reason they don't do those things is because they're good at something else, right? A very simple, but I think good illustration of this is a client of mine that I've been working with for several years now. They produce a ton of content, and a lot of the content quality is just not that great. But those are two sides of the same coin, right? Like their strength is that they produce a ton of content, and they've been their business is growing, hand over fist, and it's very easy to walk into that situation and be like, well, it's simple. We just need to make the content quality better. But actually, like, that's a very dangerous game to play, right? Because you're directly competing with the thing that makes them good, which is that they can produce a lot of content very quickly. And so changing that system, again, comes from not a position of let's not do X, let's do Y, but rather, okay, how do we grow from where we are? How do we embrace the strength of the organization and turn that into some kind of strength in a different area? And I think that's the... Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of, the MVP approach that you talked about earlier, which is you're generating a ton of, don't say stop generating a ton of content. How about we identify one thing that we want to impact and just take a small part of what you're doing and focus it on that one thing and see how well that, what is the impact? How does that change the dynamics, et cetera, et cetera? And then once you get that one success under your belt, you then allow that to propagate throughout the organization. So,
Yep. And again, not to pick on that one example too much, but, I think a lot of that also comes from, it's very easy to come in and say, we should make the content better, but like, what does better actually mean? And can we really quantify that, right? Because I think that's also the first step in a lot of these projects is, let's not change anything. But if we can have a better understanding of how the system works as step one, then we can actually talk about change, right? And so a lot of that is about, okay, well, let's actually put in place some content quality measurement as step one. That's step one, is just observe the system. And if we can observe the system more keenly and have a better understanding of how it works, then change naturally flows from there. But trying to leap straight to, stop doing what you're doing, that's the thing that makes you good, and try and do a different thing, that's not going to set you up for success.
No, that's perfect.
And what's the nature? Yeah.
Janet Driscoll Miller actually mentioned that because her newest book that's coming out, she was also on the podcast, was all about setting up data systems, using data to power change, basically. And so, some of the things she does is try to connect the disparate data points across the organization to start telling that story. So observing the data first and then just narrating it and using that as a propeller to kind of get change moving.
Yeah. Yeah, and trying to measure the right things. I mean, I think every organization is drowning in data, but the data doesn't necessarily tell them what is actually useful for them. I think I think it's almost universally true that the organizations under-index on qualitative kind of data gathering. They have a ton of metrics, but do they actually have an understanding of what's going on? I think that there's a natural kind of like ebb and flow inside an organization of when you set something new up for the first time. You have a relatively good understanding of why the process that you're creating is connected to the outputs. But as you go further on, the process becomes more and more disconnected from the outputs. And so you start managing and measuring the process and have kind of forgotten the actual outputs. And so again, a consultant's job often is just to rebalance the system slightly, to say, let's just do a first principles exercise to connect the process back to the outputs, because we haven't done that in a while. And what we find along the way is that actually the process is not producing the outputs that it was set up to produce in the first place for a variety of reasons. And so again, this comes back to that kind of first principles is before we change anything, let's just have a look, right? Let's just make sure that we interrogate what's going on correctly and add some visibility. And again, that kind of data, it can be really small, right? It can be very, like, we talk a lot about big data, but the field of ethnography has this concept of thick data, which is this, data that is kind of rich with insight and rich with kind of nuance. And I really love that mindset and try and bring that to a lot of what I do, which is, okay, you publish, 20,000 articles a month. Let's just kind of pick 5 or 10 that start from, completely start to finish. And let's just take a look at them and kind of really try and understand what happened along the way. Why did we make it in the first place? What was the brief look like? What was the content that we got back from the writer? How did it go live on the website? How did it perform? And why did we do that whole circle? And, some of those data points can be very powerful and effective, especially when you're talking back to the executive team, right? I've been in presentations where we say, okay, we track 10 articles from start to finish, and 5 of them didn't do what they set out to do. And that can be a very compelling data point, even though it's only 10 data points, right? It's only 10 pieces of content, but right. It's a very simple story that illustrates your point and can actually help an executive be like, oh, right, yes, we need to do something about that. Now, what we do about it is an entirely another question, and we can talk about that later. But at least bringing everyone to the table to say, well, the system we currently have is not functioning in the way that it was set out to, can be a very powerful kind of starting point.
Excellent. Well done.
Sorry, we got excited and rambled.
Oh, this is exactly the kind of stuff we're looking for. This is
quiet
really
listening.
Fantastic.
Thanks so much for listening.
To find out more about our podcast and what we are up to, go to digitalmarketingvictories.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please, if you like what you hear, spread the word. Rate us, comment, and share.
We're always looking for new topics, ideas, and guests. So if you have suggestions, please go to our website or email us at questions@digitalmarketingvictories.com.
And thanks for listening.